You had the criminal side of the investigation, but then you had the scientific part of it. We needed to understand how you could make this, because weaponizing anthrax is not an easy thing. Turning it into spores is not an easy thing. So we needed to understand that better. We needed to be aware of who would have those types of skills and arm ourselves with as much knowledge as we possibly can in order to be prepared for this. So that was all part of it. So you had the criminal side, but then we were worried about the scientific side of it.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzullo. Our guest today is former Secret Service Special Agent and author Steve Monteiro to talk about his thrilling new book, The Gray Bird of Baghdad. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the death of Saddam Hussein, scientists who worked for the regime were killed or left the country. When one of them, microbiologist Thamer Abdul Rahman Imran, learned that the regime wanted to arrest him and that Iraqi insurgents wanted to kill him, he went into hiding. Racing against time, ex-Secret Service agent Steve Monteiro and his team from the Department of Homeland Security set out to find the missing scientist and learn what he knew about biological weapons. The journey took them from the White House to the Middle East as they fought bureaucrats in Washington who seemed to want them to fail. The Gray Bird of Baghdad tells the true story of one man's quest to protect his country and another man's fight to save his family from the ravages of a country at war. It's my great honor to welcome former Secret Service agent and author Steve Monteiro as today's guest on Heroes Behind Headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzullo.
I'm from Boston. I'm born and raised in Boston. I guess you can say, Ralph, I got the bug early on for things like the military, like the police as a young child. So I was one of the fortunate ones. I kind of figured out what I wanted to do with my life early on. My dad had been in the Merchant Marines in World War II. So going along, serving my country, that's what I wanted to do. So the Navy was sort of a good fit for me. I go back a ways because I joined the last 4 years of the Vietnam War. I had a great opportunity there. I was a cryptologist, so I worked on some pretty amazing things for an 18-year-old.
Yeah, sure.
I got out of the military and I pursued my goal eventually of becoming a police officer, and then that sort of morphed into being a Secret Service agent. So it worked out great for me as a terrific career, and so here we are.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about your career as a Secret Service agent? Were you guarding somebody or were you doing something else? Because I know Secret Service agents have various duties.
Most people are not aware that the original responsibility of the Secret Service was to stem counterfeiting. We were created in 1865. It was one of the last official acts that Abraham Lincoln signed into law before he was assassinated. But it had nothing to do with protecting the president then. It was to stamp out the rampant counterfeiting that was occurring in the United States at that time when individual states printed up their own money. So it was estimated at that time that almost 1/3 of the money in circulation was counterfeit.
Wow.
So it was a significant problem for the country and financially almost brought us to its knees. So the Secret Service was created. It was the only federal investigative agency at the time. And within 10 years, we pretty much took care of the counterfeiting issue back then. Mm-hmm. And then as time went on, we were utilized for other investigative issues. And it wasn't until President McKinley was assassinated that they decided, hey, we need actual federal protection for our presidents, and that's when we began to do that. So it has a dual mission, protection, which most people are aware of because that's sort of the public-facing side of what we do. But we do a lot of work investigatively. When I started in the Secret Service, I was assigned to the Boston field office and conducted a myriad of financial investigations. And I was also a polygraph examiner, which was really cool because I got to do a lot of polygraph examinations, not only in the United States, but outside of the country as well, into a whole host of criminal acts, from murders to threats against the president to terrorist activities, crooked lawyers, crooked cops, you name it all. So it was interesting.
Wow. I mean, we hear a lot about polygraph and how accurate it is. How do you feel about it?
Well, in the hands of a trained person, it's an outstanding investigative tool.
Mm-hmm.
And the results of a polygraph are not admitted into court because it's a scientific opinion.
Right.
But we really weren't concerned about that because we would get the person to confess. And if the person confessed to the crime, you didn't have to worry about admitting the scientific opinion as to whether they were telling the truth or not.
Right.
So that was our goal, and it's really effective. And I've resolved countless investigations using polygraph.
Interesting. So let's move forward to 9/11 because that's really where your book starts. And interestingly, you were part of a Secret Service team that was sent down to Ground Zero the day of or the day after.
Yeah, it was. I was part of a team that was sent up there. There were other agents that were sent up there as well, and of course, we had an office in one of the buildings that were taken down, which was at number 7 World Trade Center. So we already had agents up there, but they clearly needed supplemental agents up there to help them out. It was the largest crime scene in American history, so it was all hands on deck. So we went up there to participate in the process of the crime scene, and early on, maybe there are people down there that are still alive, but it became pretty evident that that was not going to be the case, that we weren't able to save anybody. But nonetheless, the crime scene itself had to be processed, and we were part of that.
It sort of leads into the unusual mission that you were assigned later.
9/11 began the whole story for me and for the country. In the early days, we weren't exactly certain who was behind it, but we felt it had Mideastern ties to the actual attack in 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
That led to us, the FBI, looking into further and determining that Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, had something to do with this. And then it just morphed into defining who was responsible for this. And then that eventually led to us invading Iraq in March of 2003. And it was under the premises that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and we certainly couldn't let a dictator like Saddam Hussein possess those types of weapons and then, literally threaten the world. That's what led us to Iraq eventually, but it started at 9/11, and then it eventually morphed into our involvement in Iraq. But the truth of the matter is, Ralph, that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11.
Yeah.
He hated the Taliban. He hated Al-Qaeda. He kept them out of their country. And I think that was evident in his horrible escape plan. I believe he didn't think the United States would actually attack, but we wound up doing that under the premise of him having weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. Was this something that you were personally involved in?
When we got in there in Iraq, there was a big concerted effort to find these weapons of mass destruction because that was a justification for the war.
Right.
And as time went on, they realized they were having difficulty in finding these weapons of mass destruction. And there was a great deal of pressure on President Bush as our troops started coming home in flag-draped coffins. Where are these WMDs that you claimed that they had that led us to this war?
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, there was a great deal of pressure put on to find them. And they actually went out and rounded up a lot of scientists, a lot of people that worked in these areas in Iraq. And that is how the scientist that I was involved in, wound up getting caught up in that. And he was actually imprisoned in their attempt to try to find these WMDs.
I have a friend who was the SEAL Team 6 WMD officer. When he arrived in Baghdad days after the invasion, he ran into George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA. And George Tenet asked him why he was in Iraq. And he told him, and George Tenet said, "You're not going to find any."
That's interesting. Yeah. If you just think back for a second, I remember when Colin Powell, went and testified in front of the UN.
Yeah.
And held up that little vial and claimed that this is, anthrax is in here and this could kill, tens of thousands of people with just this little vial.
Mm-hmm.
And he was well respected. And just a few weeks later, we wound up invading Iraq. But later on, he basically stated on many occasions that Iraq was probably his greatest regret.
Yeah. Let's talk about your involvement, because you end up retiring from the Secret Service and getting another job. And that leads into this whole wild investigation that you were a part of?
I retired in December of 2005, and I was still fairly young, so I was looking for other opportunities. And I'm not quite sure how this company got my resume. I don't recall ever submitting it to them, but I got a call from this company asking me to come in for an interview. And it was a well-known, consulting firm. I was somewhat familiar with them, good reputation. It's a large consulting firm. So when I got there, they said, we're looking for someone with your skill set. That was kind of interesting since I was a criminal investigator and protected U.S. presidents. So I'm not quite sure how they made that connection, but so I said, okay, well, that's great. So anyway, I went through the series of interviews and talking about the company and things like that. So we kind of got around to talking about, what they could do for me and everything else. And the interesting thing, Ralph, is throughout the whole conversation that I had with them, and there were several, they never told me exactly what they wanted me to do. that just didn't occur. So I thought for a moment that, it may be a classified program that they don't know anything about, which is what turned out to be the case.
Yeah.
So anyway, I went back and talked to my wife and I said, it's a good company. They're offering me a good salary, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so we decided, well, let's just go ahead and I'll go ahead and take the job on a leap of faith. So I just caution your readers never to do that. So I did. I took this job on a leap of faith. And what I did know was that I was assigned to the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate. And within that, there's a small group called the Research and Development Group. So that much I did know. So when I reported there, you go through the typical orientation, the passwords and everything else, and here's your office and all that. I still had no clue until about maybe two and a half weeks later when I got called in to the Deputy Director of R&D. And I specifically remember he was a Navy guy as well. He was a submariner and I was a cryptologist. So we just talked a little bit about our time in the Navy. And then he opened up this government safe, which I was very, very familiar with, and pulled out this binder and it was marked secret. He handed it to me and said, go back to your desk and read this. It'll tell you what we want you to do. So that was the extent of the briefing I got. So I went back and I opened up this binder and I was sort of thumbing through it and looking, well, I was reading it intently, I should say, going through it. And literally the hair on the back of my neck just kind of like rose up and I was just so apprehensive. And I said, they want me to do what? It turned out to find this missing bioweapon scientist who was somewhere in Iraq, somewhere in Syria, or perhaps dead because he had information that was vital to us. So that was my assignment, and that's how it happened.
Crazy.
Yeah, to say the least.
Totally unexpected.
Sure.
You must have been flabbergasted.
Yeah, I was. And there was also the personal side of the issue as well, because, obviously we were at a war with Iraq and, I'm a military veteran and I was very affected by 9/11, like most people were in the country. And having been there and standing on the graves of 3,000 people, it just really affected me. So now I have to, go somewhere in the Middle East to rescue this Iraqi or find this Iraqi. So I had some personal issues with that. But I took this job and I felt that it was important to do this, to find out what he knew for the sake of the country. So just put those personal feelings aside like you do in most instances and you do your job.
But they didn't tell you at the time why this particular scientist was so important to them.
No, and that's not uncommon because on classified programs, you're only told what you need to know. Later on, I sort of found out what was going on, but in initial phases of it, and that wasn't unusual. So you're only told what you need to know just in the case of an accidental release of the information or even a deliberate release, which we've had happen in the past. You can only do so much damage by not knowing the whole story.
This individual is Thamer Imran, and he was a microbiologist.
Yes.
This man was a scientist, not a particularly fervent follower of Saddam Hussein, but like a lot of other scientists, assigned a job and went about doing it the best he could. But the impact of our invasion of Iraq was horrific for him and his family.
Yes, it was. And as I got further into the investigation in the case, I did uncover some of what happened to him, which was, part of that pressure that I had mentioned earlier about finding WMDs.
Right.
After we invaded in March of 2003, he was working as a microbiologist. And he went to work. I mean, he kept reporting to work because that was, what he was expected to do.
Right.
eventually all the work that he was involved in sort of stopped, and he was given duties to sort of guard his building that he was working in because there was a lot of looting going on. There was a lot of turmoil. And so they wanted to protect it. So he was kind of given that duty. So he wasn't actually doing any microbiology at that time, but he still reported to work because he needed the money, he needed to get paid.
Yeah.
So in June, there was a military convoy pulled up in front of his building. And he wasn't sure if they were military, if they were sort of civilians, or who these people were, but they confronted him at that particular point, and they actually had a poster, almost like a wanted poster with his picture and other biographical data on it. And they asked him, "Are you Thamer Imran?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "Come with me." And that's what started this whole thing. When they finally identified who he was, they got on, I guess it was maybe a telephone, and said, "The Gray Bird is in the net." And he thought, well, that must be referring to me. He couldn't really realize, what that meant. And of course, he had gray hair, so he kind of thought that that's why they called him that. But he said the Gray Bird is in the net. And of course, that later became the title of the book.
Yeah.
But he was, taken into custody at that point. A hood was placed over his head, and he was carted off. And that began, a pretty terrible odyssey for him. And of course, at the time that he was arrested and locked up, his wife, Iman, was home, fully expecting that he would return that day, and he never did.
Yeah.
It was 7 months before she learned that he was even, dead or alive.
Before President Saddam Hussein launched a war against neighboring Iran in 1980, Iraq, which today is a country of around 45 million people, was considered a beacon of civilization, trade, and cultural exchange, and a country rich in history and natural resources. It's a Muslim majority country and home to Iraqi Kurds as well as the Shia and Sunni Islamic sects. Iraq gained its independence from the British in 1932 and in 1968 became a republic under the leadership of Abd al-Karim Qasim. However, that was short-lived as the Ba'ath Party overthrew Qasim and took over Iraq's leadership, which continued when Saddam Hussein was elected president in 1979. The next year, 1980, Saddam Hussein declared war on Iran in a war that lasted 8 years and ended in a stalemate, leaving over 1 million dead. From then on has followed years of conflict, crippling sanctions, and terror attacks. Iraq was a pretty sophisticated society with a lot of people, a lot of educated people, and suddenly everything changes.
Sure. It was, completely disruptive. We began, a bombing campaign and hit a lot of, crucial things, communication centers and things like that. And it made it difficult to live. I mean, hospitals were overwhelmed with people that were injured. Everything became very difficult to get. The price of everything just skyrocketed because it was difficult to get the normal things because everything had been disrupted. Mm. So that was a big issue just to, sort of survive. And you didn't think about your life in terms of years and months. It was, days and weeks because of the war. And it was a pretty brutal situation for, a lot of innocent Iraqis that had to endure this.
Yeah. And definitely Thamer and his family were caught up in this because they had sounds like a pretty prosperous life, a good life. And then suddenly everything is disrupted and you're considered a suspect of some sort.
Sure, absolutely, and it was. He was, I guess he was a microbiologist, and his wife Iman worked in agriculture, and they had children. He was just a man going to work every day, like we all do, and then all of a sudden one day your life is just completely turned upside down by events completely out of your control, and that's what happened to him.
Yeah.
But not only him, a lot of other Iraqis as well. I mean, it was estimated that maybe 40 million Iraqis that were living there at the time of the war, and I'm sure there were 40 million stories. This was one of them.
Yeah. He's in custody, I believe, for 2 years.
2.5 years, yes.
And endures torture and pretty horrible conditions. And at the end of that period, he's just sort of let go.
Yes, and that's exactly what happened. So he was released after about 2.5 years in custody, and there was really no rhyme or reason. He was just released. But prior to that, Ralph, we realized, and this wasn't me, I wasn't involved in it at that time, that he had certain skills and certain knowledge that could benefit us because of a situation that was happening here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most people, in September, 11th, 2001, that dominated the world, right?
Sure.
But shortly after that, just a few weeks after that, the largest biological terrorism attack occurred in the United States.
Yeah.
It got overshadowed by 9/11 because we were still covering Ground Zero and the Pentagon and all of that. But it was the largest biological terrorism attack in the United States. And it went on for years before we even began to close in on who we thought might have committed that crime.
Yeah.
Of course, it was involved with anthrax, but we were worried about other biological agents. Somebody was in the country murdering people.
Yeah.
What other biological agents might they have? When would they strike again? And what would our defenses be? So we were totally, in my opinion, at that time, it was totally inadequate in answering all of these questions. So when they came across Thamer and they realized his background, he became a person of interest to us.
Yeah.
And he was interviewed at that time while he was still in prison. And promises were made and all of these things were sort of worked out. Then I don't know what happened after that. The fog of war, lots of stuff was going on at the time. He was just released. And of course, my job to find him would have been a lot easier if he was still in prison, but that turned out not to be the case. And so I had a missing Iraqi scientist who could have information to help us somewhere on the loose.
And also, this is a man who is been in prison for 2.5 years, as you said. He's released into a very changed and dangerous situation. I mean, because there was a huge foreign influx of jihadists into Iraq. He really didn't know if he was a target of the jihadists, or I'm sure he didn't trust the United States at this point. So he was a kind of a guy, not knowing who to trust, which I'm sure made it more difficult for you to find him.
Yes, it did. And I certainly don't blame him given the circumstances. And, to your point about the influx of jihadis and that came in to join the fight, I think we were a little bit overwhelmed by that because, when our military first went in there, the Republican Guard sort of broke and ran and we took over the country pretty quickly. It was a big invasion and we just took it over. But what we didn't expect was the influx of foreign fighters by the thousands that came in to support, their cause.
Yeah.
And that added to the pressure. And you mentioned the pressure on Thamer. The jihadis, they realized that it would be difficult for them to defeat us militarily. I mean, we were just so overpowering in our military forces, our technology. So what they did was they embarked on a campaign to kidnap the scientists within Iraq. Mm-hmm. And their mission was to try to disrupt the Americans from standing up the new Iraqi government. Mm-hmm. So if you want a new government to fail, one of the strategies that you might use, that they used, was to wipe out their brain power.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they tried to do. I mean, literally hundreds of scientists were assassinated, kidnapped, disappeared during this campaign. So when Thamer was released from prison, there was also that issue to deal with, that he could be one of these people that would be targeted because it was happening all over the country.
Yeah. And it seems as though his options were extremely limited. He had to be very careful with his movement. And as you mentioned before, he also had a family that he was worried about. What a terrible situation for a man like that to be in.
It was very, very stressful for him. And to add another element to the issue is that we had information that the new Iraqi government had a warrant for his arrest.
Wow.
And that just might have been because he worked for Saddam Hussein. And you have to understand, even though we went in there was still a lot of infighting between the Shias and the Sunnis. That was going on. There were warring gangs. There were insurgent groups coming in. So it was a whole plethora of just this toxic soup of all these groups trying to gain control. So that was another issue. So I don't know if the arrest warrant was because he worked for Saddam, who was a Sunni, and he was a member of the Ba'ath Party. And now the Shias are taking control because Saddam is gone, so they issued an arrest warrant. So, think about this. You have your government on one side looking to arrest you, and then you have the insurgents on the other side looking to kidnap or kill you, and you're released into this horrible environment called Baghdad, which at the time was the most dangerous city on the planet.
Yeah. And it just seemed to me, based on, people that I know and I was talking to and so on, is that we were just not prepared at all to govern Iraq. I mean, it was one thing to overthrow the Republican Guard and displace Saddam Hussein, but you're talking, as you said, a country of 40 million people, a pretty sophisticated country that was very divided in terms of their religious affiliations between Shias and Sunnis. And then we walk into the picture and we're kind of left with running and policing an entire country without the knowledge of the culture or the language. It's understandable that with all the things that we were concerned with at the time, that a man like this, who was so important, would be in our custody and just be released.
Well, that goes back to the fog of war. I don't know, and I never did find out why our relationship with him just didn't go forward. Again, he was released, and so he realized that, that this could be problematic. Now, we did maintain contact with him, but for some reason, it was just never followed up on. And I talk about that in the book, in which we sort of cut off communications with him and he was kind of left alone to drift out in the wind. And that's when he decided that he needed to keep moving, and he just moved from place to place to place. He adopted a disguise. He dyed his gray hair black. He donned glasses. And then eventually he tried to get out through Syria and made that dangerous trek from Baghdad to the Syrian border with his wife, trying to use that as an escape mechanism to get out from the chaos of the war in Baghdad.
And then the case lands on your desk.
Yes.
And at this point, he's been released from prison. He's out there somewhere. As you said before, you didn't even know if he was dead or alive.
Right. No, I didn't because I didn't have any direct communication with him. So yeah, it was detective gumshoe work, right? So you start, pulling the pieces out, and the first thing I had to do was get help, because when I got this thing I was by myself.
Yeah.
And so I did. I got a couple of good team members, Jim Elseth and Kevin Kelly. Jim was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. And sadly, he lost his brother, who was a naval officer in the attack on the Pentagon, which was, unfortunate. And Kevin was an HSI special agent, which was very helpful because I knew at some point I might have immigration problems.
Yeah.
If I did catch up to him, how to get him back into the country, which that all went to crap as well. But I had a good team in place.
Yeah.
And then I started making contacts with the State Department, because all of this was under their control. Mm-hmm. And from there, that led me to contacts with the embassy in Baghdad, and just started building those blocks that I needed in order to try to find him.
And you had a very sympathetic and helpful supervisor.
I did. Dr. Maureen McCarthy, she was a great, her mission was, listen, we have this issue. We have this we're woefully lacking in our defenses. We need to understand, biological terrorism more, and we need to get as much information as we possibly can.
Yeah.
So she was a fighter and an inspiration, because she had to fight a lot of battles in order to get this small group from R&D. Like, who the hell are you guys, right? This is like CIA stuff, and you got this
right.
R&D guys from the Science and Technology Directorate, running around the Mideast trying to find somebody. So we got a lot of pushback from that, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. So how long does it take you to make contact with him?
Well, it took quite a while, because we would have to go to the Homeland Security Council and get their blessing and their permission to do it. And it was always, in D.C., they have a term they call slow rolling. It's very popular. So another agency can't come right out and say, we're not going to work with you, not going to help you. So they'll slow roll you. Well, we need to study it more.
Yeah.
Well, so-and-so is on the Homeland Security Council, but he's leaving in 2 weeks. So we need to wait for his replacement.
Yeah.
Well, we got to get everybody on board. Let's take another look at, it's slow rolling. And I wasn't totally unfamiliar with it, but a lot of that went on because they just didn't want us to be messing around with this scientist. I think there was a little bit concerned about what he might say about what had happened to him.
Right.
Whether or not he might say, yes, we do have WMDs, and what an embarrassment that would be.
Right.
Because, we started this war under the premise that we had WMDs, and then we realized they weren't there. Then the focus became, well, we need to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he's a bad actor. And I don't disagree with that, but it completely changed the rationale as to why we were there. Mm-hmm. Now, going after Saddam Hussein as a bad person, well, the world is aplenty with those, and as you know, Ralph. But that became the focus, and Vice President Cheney took that on as his mission to talk about Saddam, and the WMD stuff was put on the wayside. They got over that hump.
Yeah.
The last thing they wanted to do was bring that whole discussion back
Right.
on the front burner.
By the way, we missed
them, and here they are. We don't have them. We have them. We don't have them. Yes, we do have them. That would have been, problematic.
Right. And as you said before, you were sort of a small, out of the way group. So it wasn't like you were talking to the White House and the president. This wasn't exactly a big priority, even though it was a bigger priority than you realized at first.
Again, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if somebody you think has knowledge, to help us to prevent a biological attack or to understand it or to disrupt it, then you want to find out what they know. For example, I've gone all over the world with people you think have knowledge, informants and things like that. That's not, uncommon thing. Conducting polygraph examinations, you don't know what they're going to say, but that's your job. You have to find out.
Right.
So it was important to us from the medical thing. But then, the politics of it, I think, might have looked at it a little bit differently than what we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So you were pretty much on your own. You were not getting the red carpet treatment, let's say.
No, it was more like the dirty carpet treatment. Yeah, so that's why it took so long, because there was just so much resistance. And was anybody going to come out and raise their hand and said, yeah, this is the reason why we did it? No, you'll never find out why. But it was just a slow roll, a slow process. And then finally, my boss dropped the nuclear bomb, and we actually went to see Secretary Chertoff, member of the president's cabinet, to brief him on this, and I have to say he was absolutely amazing, and he got it. He said we don't need to wait until a biological problem rolls up on a beach in New Jersey before we deal with it.
Right.
If we have to go wherever we have to go to get knowledge to help protect us, that's what we'll do. Mm-hmm. We met him in the skiff at DHS headquarters, along with the Deputy Secretary Jackson, and they came in, and he basically said, tell me what I need to know, what decisions I need to make. You got 5 minutes, go. We gave him the story, and at the end of it, he said, okay, go get him. That helped us out.
Right. So let's talk about your initial contact with Thamer. He must have had huge misgivings because of what he'd been through.
Yes, my initial contact with him was through the phone. It's the typical connect with somebody that might know him, who might know him, who might know him. So let me just digress 1 second. So the State Department realized the issue with the scientists, what was happening when they were being kidnapped and so forth. So they were very concerned. We were very concerned about proliferation issues. Somebody might snap them up and use their trade craft or use their skill set against, coalition forces. So they were worried about these scientists who are now displaced because they had no place to work because we pretty much bombed them out of existence. What was going to happen to them? So they created this...
Unprotected.
Right, and they're unprotected, sure. So they created this program called ICSI, which is the Iraq Interim Center for Science and Industry. And it was a program in which they attempted to keep track of these scientists, where they were, and they provided a small stipend to these various scientists to keep them coming in, reporting, to be on our side.
Uh-huh.
So they did the best they could with what they had. I started there, and then, you make a connection with someone else, and then someone else who might know someone else. And then eventually I was able to get in contact with Thamer by phone. And that was a little bit dicey, because he didn't know what I was all about. He never met me, didn't know me.
Yeah.
The agencies that I was from were completely foreign to him.
Right.
Was this a trap? Was this someone trying to get me to come out of my hiding? So it was a little bit sketchy when I first called him.
He spoke English, right?
He did. It was passable. They were a little bit difficult, but he did speak English. Yes. Yes.
And how do you convince him that your motives are not nefarious?
It was slow. It was a slow process. And as I mentioned, I had made that initial contact, introduced myself. And of course, he didn't say much. He was just more or less listening. And then that was followed up by more conversations over the phone, trying to break down the barrier and let him know that this wasn't any kind of nefarious trap or anything like that, that we generally did want to speak with him. Mm-hmm. And that's what this was all about. So it just took a lot of time. In the meantime, we were conducting one of the largest investigations that we've ever conducted in the United States into the Anthrax issue.
Yeah.
And that was going on simultaneously because we still hadn't solved it. We had no idea who it was or when they might strike again. So there's a lot of pressure to try to find them.
But at that point, you didn't even know that you were involved in that investigation, did you?
Obviously, I was a federal investigator, so I'm the guy's a microbiologist. You sort of put two and two together. I didn't directly connect all the dots at the time, but I figured he was important to someone.
Right.
So in the early days when I didn't have the knowledge, I was like, so my job was like being an Uber driver, right? I was going to go find him, pick him up, and hopefully get him to cooperate. And then scientists would take over from there, which was what happened, to get into the actual weeds of the knowledge. So that was sort of how it initially broke. But I had obviously a clue that he was important to someone and it had something to do with microbiology.
But they didn't bring you in to that aspect of the bigger investigation into anthrax.
No, that was being conducted by the FBI, but this was related to that.
Yeah.
It was a part of it, So the FBI had the job of finding the bad guy, right? But there was so much more to the whole issue. It's like, how was the anthrax made? Who would have the capability to do it?
Yeah.
The scientific part of it, which was just as important, because that can often lead you to the culprit. And of course, we were worried about how could two terrorists cook up biological agents out of an apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Again, we were just vulnerable at that point. Anthrax is a very common bacterium. It's found in soil, so it's easy to get at. So it's probably one of the bacteriums that we're most concerned with because of the ease of getting it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, someone was able to weaponize it, which was very, very scary.
Which is the complicated part, right?
The complicated part, yes, because you can get anthrax through livestock and things like that. And if you get cutaneous anthrax, which is through your skin, you'll get sick. But if you get treated, you'll be okay. But if you get inhalation anthrax through spores in your lungs, that's a whole different story. That's the deadly form of anthrax.
And people did die.
People did die, yes. And, our concern was, where would they strike again?
Yeah.
And would they branch out and use other biological agents, like, for example, Vaccinia pestis, which is the plague, or tularemia, or brucellosis, or get into any of the viruses like smallpox and any of the hemorrhagic fevers, or even get into some of the toxins like ricin. So there's a whole host of viruses, bacterium, and toxins that could be available to someone with bad intentions.
And we did know at that point that Saddam Hussein had been doing experimentation with these biological weapons. Isn't that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. He had a bio program at a facility called El Hakam, and that is where they cooked up a lot of bioagents, including anthrax.
Wow. I remember when it happened, and I remember keeping pace with the investigation, what you would hear in the press. And I just remember that it was very prolonged.
Yes.
And it took a lot of different routes, and it just seemed to go nowhere.
Yes. Very, very difficult to track it down. That's why, again, you had the criminal side of the investigation, but then you had the scientific part of it. We needed to understand how you could make this, because weaponizing anthrax is not an easy thing. Turning it into spores is not an easy thing.
Yeah.
So we needed to understand that better. We needed to be aware of who would have those types of skills and arm ourselves with as much knowledge as we possibly can in order to be prepared for this. So that was all part of it. So you had the criminal side, but then we were worried about the scientific side of it.
The 2001 anthrax attacks occurred in the United States over the course of several weeks, beginning on September 18, 2001, 1 week after the 9/11 attacks. Letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and to Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, killing 5 people and infecting 17 others. Capitol police officers and staffers working for Senator Russ Feingold were exposed as well. According to the FBI, the ensuing investigation became, quote, one of the largest and most complex in the history of law enforcement. They are the only lethal attacks to have used anthrax outside of warfare. A major focus in the early years of the investigation was bioweapons expert Stephen Hatfield, who was eventually exonerated. Bruce Edwards Iwins, a scientist at the government's biodefense labs at Fort Detrick, Maryland, became the chief suspect in April 2005 when he was put under surveillance. On July 29, 2008, Iwins died by suicide from an overdose of acetaminophen. Was it 2007 that you first made physical contact with Thamer?
Yes, it was in 2007. We finally got permission to go to Iraq
Yeah.
and start the process of trying to make contact with him. But there were times when I would try to reach him and there was no answer. As I mentioned, he tried to make that trek to Syria. So there's a lot going on. And I was just concerned that we didn't have time on our side,
Yeah.
that either he might get captured or killed or just, decide not to cooperate, or a variety of different things could happen. So,
Yeah.
but we finally did in 2007 actually make physical contact with him, try to convince him that we weren't there to harm him, that we were really trying to get his assistance and his help.
And you had 3 days, right, to get him to cooperate.
Well, we didn't have a lot of time to convince him. So what we were allowed to do was get what they call a proffer, which is, here's what I can tell you, that type of thing, which is, more of a legal term, but that's basically what it came down to be. We really would need a really thorough, long-term scientific debriefing of him. One of the things that we thought about was, okay, well, we'll meet him up in Erbil, which is in the northern part of Iraq, which is under control of the Kurds, which at the time were still our friends, that it would have been a safer environment. But then we thought it might be a lot easier to get one man out than to get a whole bunch of scientists in. So we kind of nixed that and just focused on, okay, we've got to get him out of here.
Yeah.
We've got to get him to some place where we can conduct these debriefings to get the knowledge that he had. But I had to get that proffer. That was a little bit of a storyline trying to get that.
Yeah.
They didn't want us to be dragging this thing out. Again, this was part of the, what I think was somewhat of the resistance to it. So, they finally had to acquiesce, but it was, trying to get the information as quickly as you possibly can. So that was our first meeting with them.
And so you go back in 2007, and you've been to Iraq before this, right?
Yes.
What was your impression?
It was a country in turmoil. At that particular time, my feelings were mixed because, we now know a lot more information. At the time, I didn't know, did he have WMDs? Was that justification there? So, I'm being a former veteran. I support our military troops. I was one of them at one point. He's a bad guy. This is a bad situation. We're here. We need to do our work. The Iraqis welcome the Americans, believe it or not. They did. They tore the statue down of Saddam Hussein in Ferdo Square, and this was liberation for them. But soon that changed, which goes back to your point about our military being acting as policemen. That's not their role.
Yeah.
And it never turns out well when we embark on that strategy.
Yeah. I remember before the invasion, people calling me because I had written a book about Afghanistan, and I knew a lot of the people who were involved in the political transition in Afghanistan. They call it nation building, right? But it's hardly nation building.
Sure.
And people were asking me, are we going to invade Iraq? And I'm like, it seems hard to believe that we are, because sure, it'd be easy to go in and, get rid of the Saddam Hussein and pacify the military there. But then the enormous job of managing the country, as far as I know, the people I'm talking to, they're not prepared for this. In fact, they've pushed aside a lot of the people who were involved in Afghanistan. And really, Secretary Rumsfeld wanted the military to run this exclusively. He didn't want help from the RAND Corporation or the State Department or these other places. And I'm like, I think it's impossible, And they went ahead and invaded anyway. And pretty soon, soldiers are picking up garbage on the street and trying to fix the electric grid and so on and so forth, things that they're absolutely not trained to do.
Sure.
And you can see why the whole society broke down and people started to lose faith in the United States, because I'm sure initially the Iraqis thought, okay, they're going to come in, they're going to take over, everything's going to be fine. But we couldn't even keep peace in the country, We couldn't even stop looters and so on.
Oh, sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. The whole thing just kind of collapsed. It was interesting because at one point we did request help from the CIA, and they said, "Sorry, you guys are on your own because we have an insurgency here that
Yeah.
we didn't expect." And that was
Yeah.
basically, what they said. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that's basically what the message was because we
Yeah.
had, as you mentioned, had this influx of people from around the world coming in to fight, and of course, the situation at Abu Ghraib did not help. That was a magnet for
Yeah.
thousands of more fighters to come in. So you had warring gangs. You've had the Shia still going after the Sunni going after the Shia. The Kurds are up in the north. So you got this toxic soup of all these groups. And then, of course, I applaud our military because they did what they were
Well, they
asked to
were given
do.
an impossible job.
And of course, there's always, innocent people that wind up being killed, errant bombs and things like that. And boy, you want to talk about turning the tide when something like that happens.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant. So you have all of this going on, and we're all trying to make some kind of sense of it all. It was
Yeah.
pretty chaotic.
Yeah. In the midst of this whole situation that you've described and the situation with Thamer and what he had been through, how difficult in that 3-day period was it to convince him that he could trust you to the extent that your motives were good? You weren't going to put him into custody or treat him badly or put him in prison. You're asking him to take a big leap of faith.
Yes, yes. Do you ever really know truly what someone is thinking? You don't.
Yeah.
So I never knew how comfortable he really felt, but I think for him it was a matter of options.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I could just, stay running and hiding and hope that I don't get killed or kidnapped. I guess I could just live through the war like all the other people in Iraq and the Baghdadis were suffering from, or maybe take a chance and see if this is a thing for him. So I think that's what it came down to, options. He probably would have just told me to, go pound sand if life was great for him in Iraq. I mean, but it wasn't. So, you're looking at options. Let me take a chance and see.
Yeah. Just to point out that in all of these, doing everything in Iraq, especially, even getting there and getting out was super, super difficult.
It was, it was one of these things where, man, can something just go right? Just one thing, So we asked the CIA for help, and they're like, "No, we can't. You guys are on your own." So then, before we actually left, I went to the military, and my contact took it up to General Casey because we wanted to put him on a military plane to get him out of there.
Yeah.
So initially they said, "Yeah, we'll cooperate, we'll help, right? We're all on the same team."
Right.
And then he came back and said, "Sorry, that's not going to happen because if we think there's a warrant out for his arrest, we can't be putting him on an American plane because we have a whole host of DOJ lawyers in Iraq trying to stand up the rule of law in this country, kind of tell them you can't do that kind of stuff." And so it basically was, okay, that's done. I said, okay, fine, and we'll go the normal route. But he needed a visa. You can't come into the country without a visa.
Yeah.
So I was on the phone with my contact at the Baghdad embassy. Even in Iraq, I was calling him every day. "Hey, where's the visa? Where's the visa?"
Right. We're in the same government.
Yeah, we're in the same government, right? So we trekked down Route Irish.
Which is infamous.
Yeah, infamous. Yeah, for sure. It was a little bit better when we got there, timeline, but it's still a pretty dangerous. I got to the green zone and I went to the embassy. And I walked into his office and I put my hand out to shake his hand. And I could see from his face that this wasn't going to be a good message. And he said, "You're not getting a visa." And I'm like, "You got to be kidding me." And I asked him why.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, the officers in charge at the State Department said no. I never found out the reason. And there was no appeal. That's it. They made a decision. It was done. So no visa." Now, here we are in Iraq trying to get him out. And we had no way of doing it. So we had to come up with Plan B, and that rolled into Plan C, and it rolled into Plan, E and F. But eventually, we were able to come up with something that we thought might work at the time. But it was sketchy.
Yeah. You get him out and you take him to Miami.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Yeah.
Which probably was a brilliant decision.
Well, I guess you could say yes and no. So brilliant in the sense that there's a lot of foreign, elements and it's a big city. So we thought we'd just kind of get lost in the crowd, right? Hide in plain sight type of thing.
There's no government.
Yeah.
Buildings and so on.
Yeah. And we wanted to get him out of Washington because we didn't want to take him back and have all these players pick it apart or give us any grief. because we went through the work. We didn't want to be sidelined. So, I picked it and I said, Miami was good, not a bad place to go. But the other side of the coin of that was that I'm taking a Muslim into, South
Sodom and
Beach
Gomorrah.
area, so it was like a little bit of a, little culture shock there, but we got through it. But it was, there was some humorous moments to say the least.
Yeah, a big part of the story is the relationship that developed between you and Thamer. And it's a process, right, that unfolded in a very unpredictable ways, right?
Yes, as I mentioned, I was very, very, very bitter because of 9/11. And that carried with me. I got sick from 9/11. So not that I'm okay, and there's people that have died, but the body count from 9/11 is still going on because people are dying from the toxic cleanup. I mean, it was estimated that over 2,500 contaminants were in the air and the poison air that they told us originally was okay.
I was down there
Okay.
in Manhattan, and I remember when they came out and said the air's fine. The EPA.
Yeah, that was Christine Whitman did that.
And all you had to do was smell the air, and you knew it wasn't fine. I mean, it just smelled horrible.
Oh, it was terrible. And of course, the white powder, I mean, we were covered with white dust that.
The whole building turned into dust.
The whole thing, yeah. It was
5 feet of dust everywhere. And
yeah. After we would, finish for the day, we'd go home and you take the clothes you were wearing and you throw them on the floor and, dust pile would just like spring up. It was you couldn't get away from it. It was everywhere.
Yeah.
So again, I was angry. I was bitter. When you think about people jumping,
Yeah. Oh, it was horrible.
Upside down. I mean, it just rips you apart. And then everybody, holding up signs. You remember holding up signs. Has anybody seen my mom or my dad? I mean,
they'd just be covered with little pictures and.
Oh my God, it was just a horrible, horrible thing. So yeah, bitterness hung with me. But, as I got to know Thamer, and I realized that he wasn't much different than me. He was a man trying to raise his family, and I got, to know him more intimately, and I started to see him differently, that he wasn't an enemy, that what happened on 9/11 to us and how Saddam Hussein was in terms of his craziness, he had nothing to do with it.
Right.
And often innocent victims pay the price in one government's fight against another all the time,
Yeah.
And I just started to think that, war is man's greatest failure.
Absolutely.
It basically says that I can't talk to you. I can't communicate with you.
Right.
I can't work out our differences. We can't get along. I have to kill you. And it's just a sad commentary on humanity and in the year 2025. And, as you know, it's still going on and with Ukraine and Russia and the Middle East. And, and here we are. But I just started to change personally. And then I realized, man, what happened to this guy was just not right.
Yeah.
And then the other issue that got to me was, well, when we get the information out of him, just send him back.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that didn't set right with my boss. It didn't sit right with any of us. And so she, Dr. McCarthy just went on this incredible case to change people's minds up in Washington. I was still down in Miami with Thamer dealing with getting all these different, scientists in and out and all this kind of stuff. So, and she was up there fighting that because, you just don't, someone who agrees to help you and just throw them away.
And he was cooperative immediately.
Oh, yes.
He wasn't holding back.
He was willing to do whatever it took. And the thing that really endeared me to Thamer was he did it under no thoughts that anything good would happen to him.
Yeah.
He was under no illusions that he had no guarantees. He had nothing in writing. He was just, I want to cooperate. I want to tell you, the things that I know that may help you. But under no illusions did he think that, you owe me something. That never happened. He was a gentleman throughout the whole thing, and that just endeared me more to him. And he would say to me, Mr. Steve, I know you're doing your best.
Wow. He was really putting his trust in you.
Yes. I don't know if it was the right person to put the trust in, but we just kind of bonded through our time in Miami. And then at the last second, we did get a reprieve. But even then, it was like a reprieve to keep him.
Yeah.
Because he's the one that we need. His family, that was a whole different story. So that became another battle to fight.
Yeah. The information that he provided, was that helpful in solving the anthrax case?
Well, the information he provided was placed in a classified report that I can't talk about. And to be honest with you, unless you're into the scientific part of it, which, I sat through the briefings and it was like going over because I'm not a scientist in that regard. When I deal with bioterrorism, I'm sort of coming from the investigative criminal side of the house. So even if I were to be able to tell you exactly what was in that report, it's pretty much, I would have classified that it was helpful. Yes, yes.
How did that case resolve with the anthrax? Was it ever resolved?
That's an interesting story in and of itself. So it was over a 10-year investigation trying to find it. And originally they identified a suspect or a person by the name of Hatfield, and they thought he was the one responsible. They kind of dragged him through a little bit of mud. But, again, the FBI, I'm not going to fault my brothers and sisters. They did, they were working hard on it. And it turned out to be one of the longest and most costly criminal investigations in our nation's history because it lasted so long.
Yeah.
And then eventually they honed in on a subject by the name of Bruce Ivins, and he worked up in Fort Detrick.
Yeah.
Which is an army base up there that does a lot of medical stuff. And as a matter of fact, we later created a bioforensic lab up there, and I was involved in the early stages of helping to vet it from a security standpoint of view when they started building, because we really never had a lab that focused on, bioterrorism. So we created that later on. But anyway, they honed in on Bruce Ivins. He was identified as a suspect. I don't know if they actually indicted him. They may have, but he committed suicide prior to going to trial. So we never really got to see the evidence that they had against him.
Right.
Now, this is really interesting because many of the people that worked up there at Fort Detrick, and I've been up there. I actually worked up there for a bit. We had some of my folks that were with me in consulting that worked up there. They were adamant that it wasn't him, that he could not have done this. They had a pretty significant argument to say, no, he wasn't the person involved. That's still out there. So we never went to trial. So he committed suicide, but we've not had an attack since. So you can make the argument, but that's how it ended.
Interesting. And I remember that there was a great amount of fear in the beginning because these packages were showing up in Congress, and then it kind of ended.
Yeah, it made its initial splash. They had sent letters to 2 senators and to news organizations as well. And then I think maybe 15 people were killed in that, and then others were, sickened by it.
Yeah.
But again, what really concerned us was somebody was able to weaponize this and turn it into these spores, which is not that easy to do. So we had someone around in the country somewhere who attempted to kill, 2 senior members of our government. What else would they do? So that was unknown. So it opened up a whole bunch of different things for us. And our biodefense programs then just kind of shot up.
Right.
And we engaged in a lot of biodefense issues. We had biodefense programs. We had sensors in, I think it was like 27 different cities to monitor the possible release of bioagents. We worked a lot with the medical community to identify if somebody comes into an emergency room. So it was a big issue. Now that has been supplanted as our top concern, because at the time that I was working on this was one of our top concerns was bioterrorism.
Right.
That has been supplanted now by cyber, which I understand because the bad guys have realized that, they can attack. Being at the end of the keyboard, they can do a lot of damage.
Right.
We have 16 elements to our critical infrastructure in the country, our food supply, our water supply, our energy, transportation system, medical, all of that. Those are constantly attacked every single day by hackers, state actors, non-state actors trying to get in there. And they've been successful in some cases. We're concentrating on cyber, but my concern is have we taken our eyes off the bio threat? If you've listened to Bill Gates, he talks about that a lot.
Yeah.
That's one of his major concerns, that you can weaponize smallpox or kill 30 million people. And he believes it's far more significant than an actual nuclear attack.
Yeah.
Priorities, resources. So I know our government is still involved, and I don't mean to intimate that we're not paying attention. But again, cyber has got all the marbles right now, the resources, because it is a significant threat. You take out our power grid and we don't have power for a few days.
Oh, God.
That's a horrible thought right there.
Yeah.
So, but I hope that we stay focused on the possibility, because we had a little taste of what it could look like. So all those years ago, Ralph, we were very concerned about a biological terrorism attack that could kill millions.
Yeah.
Years later, that's exactly what happened through COVID-19. Now, I'm not suggesting it was a deliberate attack, but it doesn't matter. The results are the same. Whether a biological agent is deliberately released or accidentally released, the results are the same, which is a lot of sick and dead people.
Yeah.
COVID killed, I don't know, anywhere from 14 to 20 million people worldwide, a million in the United States.
Yeah. And we still have the unanswered question of
Unanswered questions of what happened. So
why they were experimenting and why they were doing gain of function
research, yes.
But I think the point is that, there are these dangerous viruses and substances that we know about, but, you have to have experts to weaponize them often. And if we're doing it, you better make sure this stuff doesn't get released, because it could be absolutely devastating.
Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think President Trump just recently indicated his plan to stop funding gain of function research because of that very issue.
Yeah.
Now, it's a double-edged sword because, viruses morph, right? I mean, how many times you heard a new strain of the flu, that no one's seen before? So they do morph. So scientists try to get ahead of them by genetically modifying a virus and then coming up with plans to defeat it. However, it's a double-edged sword because you're creating something more deadly. And if it gets released, now you've got a serious problem.
And if it gets in the hands of people who are trying to attack us, then you got a big, big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, we picked up intel that some of the bad guys were like, nah, we don't want to mess with bio because they can't control it, right? It can come back on you. The Japanese used it against the Chinese in World War II. They used cholera. They released plague-infested fleas.
And Saddam Hussein was using it.
Yep, absolutely. So, the thought that it would never be used, I go back to, years ago, people never thought that, well, we'll never create a weapon that'll, kill millions of people. That'll never happen. Humankind won't allow us to do that. Well, how many nuclear weapons do we have now?
Yeah, I remember interviewing a Russian guy back then, Ken Albrecht. Have you ever run into him?
It sounds familiar. His name sounds familiar. Yes.
It's not his real name. One of the heads of the Soviet program, they had a big program to create biological weapons. And I remember asking him, I said, well, what happened to all that stuff you were developing during the Soviet Union? Because they had a big, extensive labs and so on, a very advanced program, I think way more advanced than ours. And he goes, oh, well, we put them, the UN buried them in these stainless steel vaults in some island in the Black Sea or something like that. I'm like, but they're still there, right?
Yeah, that's reassuring, isn't it? Yeah. Well, yeah, it's scary. Well, yeah. Well, the thing about the biological programs, I mean, there's a biological treaty that a lot of countries signed to, outlawing the use of biological weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's only as good as their willingness to tell us what they're doing. And most of these programs, all of the programs are basically secret. So, they'll say, oh, we'll sign the treaty, but then they have bio programs going on. So tough arena.
Yeah. So let's go back to Thamer. He finally gets permission to stay in the United States. And then he goes through a period of time where he's trying to get his family out.
Yes.
And you're fighting to do that. And he seemed like, pretty patient about the whole thing. And then you succeed. And there's a whole drama in your book, which I won't reveal, about getting his family out, which is very human and amusing in certain respects. And then he reunites with his family here. And you were there to snap the picture. What a moment that must have been.
Yeah, it was. And for them, because, all that they had been through, your country gets attacked, you want it in your own country, you're trying to survive like everyone else. He wasn't the only one, obviously. And then you have that culmination at the end and you say, okay, maybe sometimes good things do happen. And so that felt good for us that not only did we get the information that we had set out to get, we also kind of, I guess you can say, did a human thing.
Yeah, very human.
And said, let's try and help help this person. And that happened, in Afghanistan, where, interpreters and other people that trying to help us, and our soldiers are trying to get them out and so forth. So, yeah.
They settled here. He got employment here.
Yes, yes.
And I assume you're still in touch with him.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah. Matter of fact, I talked to him about a week ago or so.
Wow.
Yeah, just to stay in touch. So we would exchange gifts on the holidays for a bit, and so I stay on the phone with him and talk with him. So it is a good feeling.
Wow, what an enormous adjustment for people to come here.
Oh, sure. It was even more challenging for his family because of the language issues, and his sons, and had to learn English. He was a little bit better because he could speak some English. So Iman and the boys were less proficient, almost non-existent.
Yeah.
And so that was a little bit of a challenge when I was dealing with trying to get them out, was the language barrier. But anyway, they settled in, and him and Iman are now U.S. citizens.
Wow.
And they raised their right hand and took the oath.
Wow, fantastic. Fantastic. It's a great story, and it really highlights sort of the human side of the war, right? Which we don't really talk about much. But I think you had it in your book, like over 400,000 Iraqis died. And probably everybody in the country was displaced in one way or the other.
Yes. And I think that's part of what I wanted to try to convey in the story. When I originally thought I was going to write this book, it was about the mission. But then I said, there's more here. There's more to the story. I need to tell the other side. I mean, there's a lot of books and movies have been written about, the heroics of our soldiers, the American Sniper and Lone Survivor and all of the books, and tons of books. And I have great admiration for our military, but I also wanted to kind of tell the other side, the innocent people that get caught up in this. And it was interesting because I was listening to Rob O'Neill, who was the SEAL Team 6 guy involved in the Bin Laden hunt. Mm-hmm. And he said that when he first got to Afghanistan, he thought everybody was an enemy. And he realized, wait a second, no, these are just people wanting to get on with their lives and live a normal life, and not everybody is out to kill me. And that's kind of how I saw Thamer, as just a working person who was doing what his government asked and trying to, just get on with his life.
Yeah, we learn more and more how interconnected everybody is, and whatever happens in Iraq, good or bad, it affects us here in the United States in ways that, you never anticipate. I mean, it's understandable, as you've pointed out, but some really bad decisions were made at a very high level of government that affected lots of people adversely.
Yes, I think so. And again, I support, our military, they did what they were asked to do, so it's not an issue with them. But I think that, a lot of the veterans that I've talked to that actually fought there, I haven't found one that said, it was definitely worth doing it. They carry the wounds of war with them forever, and it's just a terrible thing. And I just hope we find a better way.
I hope so too. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your service and your book. It's a great story.
Well, you're very much welcome, and it was nice meeting you as well. And look forward to more of your stories on your podcast, because you have some really interesting guests, far more interesting than me.
Thank you.
I certainly enjoyed the discussion, and continued success.
Stephen Philip Monteiro retired in 2020 after more than 20 years as a U.S. Special Agent with the U.S. Secret Service, and after that, a senior advisor to the Director of Weapons of Mass Destruction Intelligence for the Department of Homeland Security, focusing on bioterrorism. For his work on Iraqi scientists, he received the Director of National Intelligence Meritorious Unit Citation. In 2020, his excellent book, The Gray Bird of Baghdad, was a Forward Indies finalist in War and Military. Today, he's the host of the podcast, The Monteiro Report, which you can listen to on Apple Podcasts and other outlets. It's my great honor to name former U.S. Secret Service agent and author Stephen Monteiro as today's hero behind the headlines.
Please join our Heroes Behind Headlines community. Go to hbhpod.com and enter your email to receive updates and information on exclusive Q&As with our host and guests. That's hbhpod.com. Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzulo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Heroes Behind Headlines.